You're listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. In this episode, writer and journalist Owen Hatherley joins Tank's Masoud Golsorkhi and Thomas Roueché to discuss his latest book, The Adventures of Owen Hatherley in the Post-Soviet Space. Over the span of several books, Hatherley has established himself as a leading voice on the intersection of architecture, cultural politics, and national identity. The new book follows Hatherley as he journeys across 11 of the 15 former Soviet states in order to track the complex legacy of the USSR. Almost 30 years after the end of history, Hatherley examines the enduring influence of the Soviet Union and how various communities interpret and interrogate notions of revolution, utopia, and communism.
I suppose what made me do it, I'm always sort of, with this question, there's a sort of entirely honest answer and a partly honest answer. And the entirely honest answer is that there was loads of material.
Right.
And there's always this sort of process whereby I think you sort of write a book and find that it's sort of leading you into other directions and you end up writing another book that sort of follows on from that book.
Yeah.
And in this case, that book was Landscapes of Communism, which was published 3 years ago, which was sort of focused on a sort of taxonomic attempt to kind of work out what communist architecture and city planning was. Communist and whatever level of scare quotes you want to put it in. And this one, kind of emerging from that, was a huge amount of material that I couldn't really talk about, which was about what those places have done since 1991, since 1989 in Eastern Europe. And that kind of ended up growing into a series of essays that I'd written from about 2015 onwards for the Calvert Journal that were usually sort of a little bit in a city guide genre.
Right.
And I'm sort of trying to do something fun with the city guide kind of stricture, rather than the kind of, here's where you can get craft beer, and here's where the techno clubs are. There's nothing about either craft beer or techno in the whole book. More a kind of, why is this city as it is? And sort of intervening a little bit in the discourse about those places and about where historically and geographically they fit. Something about which it's very difficult to kind of go there and not feel that sort of overwhelming angst about place and about recent history and about the Soviet legacy and about the presence of Russia as a sort of increasingly sort of aggressive power and their relation to the European Union, their relationship to China, and all of that was kind of kept out of that book because what that book was supposed to be about was what happened between 1917 and 1991 or between 1945 and 89 for the countries in between. Yeah, there's ended up with all of this stuff that I kind of wanted to talk about as an outsider to it, and sort of how I saw it as an outsider to it, and also a sort of frustration which I think is shared by a lot of people who are much more qualified than me at the way this stuff is talked about in the media in Britain and the US. That's happened particularly, obviously, since Trump is being elected, in which the USSR is sort of Russia is once again the USSR, and the KGB are out, kind of poisoning people in Salisbury, which of course they are, and they once again want to conquer the world, and Trump is their puppet, and all of that sort of stuff, which I think, while there's elements of truth in it, tends to put the cart before the horse. With that, there's this discourse that I find really, really offensive, particularly because it comes from someone that knows better, which comes from the historian Timothy Snyder, who sets up this sort of huge opposition between the sort of, the European Union as committed to progress and democracy and liberalism and openness and moving on from the past in a sophisticated way, and then this kind of Eurasian Oriental despotism that consists of Russia, Central Asia, and those bits of the Caucasus that didn't get to be governed by a Brooklyn hipster like Mikhail Saakashvili. So that's kind of where it came from, was having lots of sort of thoughts and ideas which about that.
Right, and about putting the record right. But in what respect was the profession of architecture or the discipline of architecture, do you think, shaped specifically by communist worldview?
Well, I think there's a sort of something specific about, if you want to reconstruct a world as they did, architects are going to be quite high up your list of potential contacts because they are the people that will design it for you. And within that, they're sort of tapping into a sort of speculative tradition that had existed for quite a long time. I mean, there's the famous thing about after October 1917, rather, when they're publishing various books and, not thinking they'll be there in power for more than a few months. One of the things they do is produce like huge editions in the hundreds of thousands of like Thomas More's Utopia, Campanella City of the Sun, New Atlantis, Charles Fourier, all of these kind of sort of ideal societies that are imagined sort of popularized in Russia through that. That was necessarily, I think, going to connect with the kind of architectural forming trends which had been emerging out of the arts and crafts movement. Out of industry, out of various kind of utopian socialist kind of ideas, and also out of kind of company towns and so on. So those things were going to meet, I think. And also architecture, because it's so big and so capital intensive, it tends to last quite a long time. Right. I mean, decreasingly so in recent years, but more than posters and ephemera and clothes and cars, it's there on the street. So if you want to read something, and you can't read the language, which I can do only to a kind of reading a children's book level in the case of Russian and Polish, then this is a great way to read it. Right. And you can read it in unexpected ways. It's quite complex and dialectical.
It's like an alphabet to a civilization kind of thing. Do you find, what's your take on the way in these travels and in these in the current situation? One of the things that we are very, in a black and white way told is that people in Russia either look at, in a nostalgic way, to communism or hate it. That there is a kind of like an absence of kind of nuance or a kind of like sophistication in the way some people are taught to be able to assess their own recent history. How can you fill in that middle?
I think the middle in that is by far the majority. I think that there are attempts, particularly in Ukraine, to replace that with a sort of much more dogmatic approach to the period, and attempts by some in Russia to do approach more dogmatically from the other way. But most people very ambiguous about it, which I think is entirely correct. I think it's a very ambiguous experience. And it's always based on this kind of idea that people out there approach space in a different way to us. There's this thing by a hack at The Guardian who I won't name, not Sean Walker, because Sean Walker is a good journalist. Someone else who isn't Sean Walker was not a good journalist. And he started a piece about the war in Donbass by talking about the fact that it had there was a statue in the centre of Clement Voroshilov, who was I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Anyway, who was a general under Stalin, and a quite inept one by all accounts. I just thought, do you know what any of the statues in Trafalgar Square are of?
Yeah. What about all the fucking... And it was just even on Megan Place. The butcher of Somme, I think, isn't he? Kind of.
Hague. Hague is there, I think. So there is this kind of idea that there, or everything, every time you walk around the street, you are constantly thinking about, about the Soviet past. And reacting to it either in a kind of yes, Voroshilov, our great hero, or oh no, Voroshilov, purchased Gulag. And of course, most people don't really give a fuck. In the same way that most people that walk past Trafalgar Square, whether English or not, don't think about who Napier is. So, and so forth. So within that, that doesn't necessarily mean indifference, but it means that people, I think, have very, very mixed feelings. I found this a lot in, Ukraine is a good example of that. That one of the things that, just anecdotally, often a conversation will begin with this was all terrible. There was the famine, there was the Gulag, there was there was the repression of our great patriots, there was this and there was that. After they've kind of almost kind of said that, done their penance, they can then go, oh, there was this really interesting thing, and there was this which I really liked, and the housing was good, and the planning now is terrible. Oh, and in the garden of my block of flats, there's now a garage that's only used by some oligarchs, and it's all shadowed by a new 40-story block. That's kind of so what you're actually describing there is how much you like communist planning. But there's a kind of, which obviously would be smug of me to point out in person, so I was pointed out in the book instead. But that's the thing, I think there's a kind of, and I think that's in many ways quite a lot how people reacted to their environment in the Soviet period. And there was a kind of, there was what you said publicly and there was what you felt privately. And often what came out was a sort of amalgam of the two. And neither was necessarily false either. It's not the kind of false self and real self. It's more a kind of a much more difficult thing where you can't really prize out what's what.
More like an emulsion rather than a Absolutely. Much of the bad journalism, the kind of the usual disease of like foreign correspondence, is conditioned by the profession, by the kind of the remit of publications, by what defines journalism, or what the guy back in London is expecting, even before you left. Like, how do you make yourself work in such a way to overturn those restrictions and kind of act like? Do you have like a routine? Do you have like a system?
I find I don't have a system, but I find reading historians is a really important thing, which sounds sort of obvious, but it's done much more rarely than there's sort of a lot of the sort of more stupid opinions on the Soviet Union and Soviet period are, I think, either come in via kind of received opinion or come in via popular history, which is usually written from the political right or written from the political far left. And there's a sort of idea that, that all of it is sort of completely overdetermined by ideology. And actually pretty much since the 80s, there's a huge quantity of very, very sophisticated scholarship that I think, if you're coming to this not being able to read Russian, can explain it vastly better than sort of going into Waterstones and buying an Applebaum book. One of the things that I really, really found incredibly useful putting together the book was Sean Guillory's blog. And his, he has on sort of a different week, a sort of historian working on all manner of kind of, there was one on Soviet Tajikistan in the 80s. There was one on, this is the last few weeks, there was one on a special school for sort of international communist sort of elite in the 30s. There was one on the Communist Youth League, and they're all generally from historians that aren't going to give you a very easy soundbite on was it good or was it bad, and we'll always kind of squirm when asked it and do it kind of like, well, you can't really see it like that, and that I think is much more useful than reading either kind of contemporary coverage or reading the kind of NGO and think tank stuff, which is all about there is something deeply wrong with this region, which doesn't match up to this particular standard, which until recently was probably Poland, but now Poland's going so far politically to the right that I'm not quite sure where is the ideal anymore. But maybe Romania, I don't know. And then measures the way that it doesn't kind of add up to that. Everything is sort of done by what the place is not, rather than what it actually is. Right. And the ways in which it differs from that. And actually, Landscapes of Communism was very much determined by which ways does it differ from and which ways is it like us, and trying to work out what the difference actually was. So in a way, it could have carried on in that sort of discourse, which this one doesn't quite, I hope.
Yeah, I was going to ask as well. I mean, because this, but the kind of drawing on what you were saying, because I think you also talk about in that session you're talking about the kind of the idea of queer communism, or that you're looking for this kind of this evidence of queer accommodation with sort of LGBT issues and
not that solely, but more a sort of. But that comes from the group Stab, which was based in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan for a while, and recently I think sort of dissolved. The work that they were doing, they included on the one hand the sort of attempt to kind of promulgate this idea of queer communism, also had a sort of focus on utopian communities, such as the sort of the extraordinary Czechoslovak Esperanto community that functioned in Bishkek for about 20 years, running as a
were they exiled? Were they Stalin exiles?
No, they people that they voluntarily left Czechoslovakia in the early 20s, went to Central Asia and set up their own utopian speaking commune, which is still there, and obviously I think very few of the communards are still there. I mean, at the end of the 30s they were repressed, but they had 15 years or so of running their own
Esperanto civilization.
Yeah, running their own civilization in Central Asia. So they had published quite a lot on that, and they published quite a lot on sort of science fiction. The last book they published was a sort of a collection of SF stories, mainly by women writers. And then there was a attempt to kind of reckon with the post-colonial history of the region, and the kind of odd thing of it, on the one hand, being a sort of post-colonial situation, of it being an inheritance from the Russian Empire, and the degree to which it did or it didn't transcend that, and also the fact that it, that this was a sort of showcase, or Central Asia was a showcase for the Third World. So you would have people coming over from from the kind of decolonizing countries after 1945, and they'd take you around Tashkent and Almaty and Bishkek and go, look what you could have. So that program I thought was really interesting because it was sort of the only one I'd really come across that was trying to do what was living and dead and Soviet socialism. What can we do with it on the left? And there are definitely people that were trying to do similar projects in Russia and Ukraine, but not on the same scale. But what's really telling is that in order to do this, they had to kind of make shit up.
Yeah.
So I came across them at a kind of big Moscow Art Foundation conference, the VAC, which I think is named after the daughter of an oligarch.
Yeah, you know her.
But so Georgy Mamedov, who's was one of the main people in the Stab, had this, gave this talk about this project that they'd done about this thing called the Kolontai Commune, where they claimed that they had found this kind of archive, which they called the Queer Communist Archive. There's a great film about this called Queer in Space that they put together, full of utopian projections and ideas about what the queer communist future will be like, and which they claimed to have found at a particular second-hand bookshop in Bishkek. And when I was in Bishkek, I was keen to interview Georgy I wanted to do an article about Stab, and I hadn't realised that they had split up, so in the end there was no article. But he was just, and I was sort of asking, just because I've met him a couple of times, and I was like, so what are the good bookshops in Bishkek? And he was like, oh, well, there's this one which is around there by so and so, and that's where we got all the stuff for the Kolontai Commune. And I was like, you mean that it wasn't found in an attic of some ancient communist? It's like, no, we made it all up. And I think now they kind of admit that they made it all up. But the presentation that he gave in Moscow was so convincing. I was just like, oh my god, this is amazing. They found the Holy Grail. They found the thing that ties it all together. This is the thing that actually kind of enables us to go forward. And of course, there is no such thing. Yeah. So there was a really interesting interview of Georgy on Juliet Jakes' podcast Sweet 212 recently, where he talked about that fact, that there isn't actually anything in the Soviet past that can solve all our problems. That can be the thing that ties it all together, but it can be quite fun to make one.
Because it's interesting because we had an issue where we were looking at issues of the future and things like this. We had an article that was kind of looking at the kind of resurgence also of cosmism as a kind of, it's become so unbelievably trendy as well in certain absolutely. But it has a similar, I think you kind of enter into a kind of strange morass where you're not quite sure what what is 100% real and what is 100, where the artwork starts and the history stops.
I think that's very deliberate. But on the other hand, a lot of what they're doing is completely, kind of archivally based. So the stuff with the Inter-Gelpo commune, which is the Esperanto one, there's the Utopian Bishkek project, the stuff on post-colonialism, completely respectable, historical work. So that's what's quite like about it. Is there's a point where that stops and then just making things up begins. But what I liked about what Stab were doing is that the closeness to sort of actual activism a lot of the time, which I think is which all of them were doing at the same time, and I think many of them now just do instead. That it was intended to make a point, and there's an anecdote that he told me, which again might have been total bollocks. But I was asking about the official Communist Party in Kyrgyzstan, which for a long time was quite an electoral force, and it's one reason why the Lenins are still there. And he was like, oh yeah, we were asked to have a joint list with them as a local election. I was like, oh yeah, were you? And he's like, yeah, which was quite funny because they're very homophobic. And we asked them about this, and they said, we'll decide that after we get elected.
No, but it's interesting because I guess it kind of takes you into interesting questions about the sort of, when you're dealing with the sort of the aesthetic, because the aesthetic, I guess the sort of post-Soviet aesthetic has become again quite trendy. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of people wanting to, on the one hand, it
project onto it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a playfulness that can be, as you say, kind of constructive and pose interesting questions. There's also a playfulness that can just be a bit of a dead end, right?
Yeah, there's always a wind-up element, but there's useful wind-ups and there's wind-ups for the sake of wind-ups. And I like the fact that they were doing useful wind-ups. But there's quite a lot in the book about very, very broadly conceived sort of groups doing some sort of civic activism through art or architecture. Also in Kiev very much. It was sort of for quite a long time was sort of Pally with a couple of people in the Visual Cultural Research Centre in Kiev who were sort of trying to carve out, I think, a space between nationalism on the one hand and neoliberalism on the other, and also was kind of away from the very, very small and dogmatic left that exists there. And I found a lot of the results really, really interesting, in that they were, very much kind of trying to intervene in this sort of new discourse that became so dominant out there after the revolution and the invasion of Crimea, which was, this kind of official anti-communism being like legally mandated, and the sort of official nationalism was being legally mandated. And they were doing, I think, a lot of very, very brave work trying to challenge that. And there's also quite a lot of, sort of things in the book of sort of people just trying to do architectural preservation, and how difficult that proves a lot of the time. And the weird fact that probably one of the capitals where they've become most successful in doing that, outside the Baltic states at any rate, is Moscow, which before was the absolute worst for that. And there's quite a lot about the sort of recent remaking of Moscow, and the kind of role, the quite, I think, ambiguous role that some institutions like Strelka have within that. These kind of, this classic civil society idea of like, we're going to have an architecture school there, and we're going to get Koolhaas to teach in it, and we're going to, and it will bring Western architecture to Russia. And there's always assumption, and with that we will bring, civil society and liberalism and so forth. And it was a phenomenal success. There were a couple of years where it looked like it wasn't really having much influence, and then basically, the mayor was dismissed, and they brought in another mayor who seemed much more sympathetic to them, and they've been remaking Moscow, particularly the centre of Moscow, into an exemplary kind of Jan Gale city of like nice public spaces and riverside parks and restored historic buildings, which 10 years ago Moscow would have been bonkers to imagine. Like Moscow was like on an absolute development bender, and had like the most kitsch new architecture in Europe by a long chalk, mostly like a neo-Stalinist thing, or sort of Stalin in Vegas kind of thing. It was kind of like they'd managed to win, but in such a way that didn't really matter. The political sphere is actually less liberal. Public space is less usable for any kind of civic action. The regime is actually more repressive, but it looks much more like Copenhagen than it used to. Copenhagen with like really, really big buildings with spires on, but it's a really pleasant city to be in now in many ways.
But my question was because I was there when Strelka was established, and there was a lot of cynicism about the greed of developers and how this was a kind of a gentrification strategy. And in fact, my anecdote I was going to tell you was my translator, which was an old communist lady in her sort of 60s, would translate what the man was telling me and then tell me in English this was a complete lie. At the same time, don't believe him, they're all crooks and murderers. And she would be doing this, but
I mean, they are all crooks and murderers. Like they really are.
But is the gentrification process? Do you mean the gentrification in particularly in that area with the chocolate factory and everything, hasn't actually led to a kind of a classic what gentrification did to London? Or
absolutely it has.
It has,
and in a way, I think that's probably what got the city government interested in the first place.
Right.
It's a sort of realisation that this kind of really brutish approach that they'd had in the 90s and 2000s under the mayor, Yuri Lushkov, which was really kind of aggressively lowest common denominator in kitchen, very, very unplanned.
Right.
Very much kind of, demolish a 4-storey building instead of 41 in its place, and, have a huge car park next to it. And really, really fucking thuggish stuff, for which I think, no nostalgia whatsoever. But that was then, you then realised that you could make just as much money by having a nice public square with some swings and some trees, and having a place.
So they're just more sophisticated thugs,
and some and get Koolhaas to design you a new museum. And I think they're absolutely right. And I think this goes back to this question of sort of determinism. This kind of idea that if you build a European style city will mean people thinking European style thoughts, which are necessarily liberal and good. Moscow has shown that you can build that European style city in a city that has ruthless official homophobia, relentless gentrification, and tortures leftists basically.
To hear more podcasts from Tang, subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.